we've actually created a sign-in page. You may not remember it because it's been a few episodes since we did that. And if we define work as we can submit a username and password and check against them, then yes, it definitely does work. But we need more than this. We're going to have pages that we want to protect. We want to restrict access to authenticated users. We want that user authentication to last for more than a single page. We want our ragtag adventurers to actually be able to log in and not just validate their username and password. That is exactly this episode's topic, and we're going to solve this problem with a node package called Passport. First, an aside, last time I said that we were going to do some more Bootstrap this time. The problem with that approach was that we don't yet have a whole lot of pages in the app, and so we can't really show off what Bootstrap does for us. So we're rerouting here to get users into the app and thus have some pages to show before we start styling them. So again, we're using Passport for our user authentication. We're not going to cover the entire topic in this episode. Passport works a bit differently than other authentication frameworks you may have used in other frameworks other than Node.js, and we need to get some concepts down before we dive into code. This episode will handle those concepts, and the next one will handle the code. Now, Passport describes itself as simple, unobtrusive authentication for Node.js, and it's not kidding. Let's talk about why that is. Even if you don't have a Ruby on Rails background, talking about Devise here won't get you lost. Devise is a library, or gem as they're called in Ruby, for Rails that handles some of the same things that Passport does for us in Node, but Devise is the space shuttle plus the kitchen sink. Devise handles username password matching, sending emails to confirm accounts, registering new accounts, tracking when people log in, locking accounts after X failed attempts, and so on and so forth. In this one library, it actually does everything, which means Devise is a very large gem. Now, I'm not saying this is good or bad, it just is. Such a library really doesn't fit with the Node philosophy, though, of having small modules that do one thing. Even though Devise is broken into many different modules itself, they're still pushing the limits of what experience has shown works well in Node.js. So what makes Passport different? If Devise is the space shuttle plus the kitchen sink, then Passport is more like the plumbing that lets the sink work. It's the wiring to the garbage disposal, the pipes that bring water in and let wastewater flow out. It doesn't actually grind up the garbage, it just supplies you with everything you need to hook up your own disposal. So an authentication solution is going to have several components. It needs to handle sessions, connect HTTP inputs to user validation code, move values in and out of cookies, make the concept of current user available to the system, and present that user to whatever authorization framework we're using. Well, this swell picture is my attempt at a component tree. Passport represents the actual tree here, and it's our job to supply the components that actually go into this. Now, we actually do want to use Passport, so let's go ahead and get that installed. This might have been pretty evident, but we need to use npm to do that, and we just do an npm install -- save passport. Now, if you go to the Passport homepage and scroll down, you'll find a section called Strategies. Strategies here refer to sources of your user's information and how we identify them. For example, we could implement the Twitter strategy, which would mean that we'd provide an Authenticate with Twitter button to users, and they would click that, go log in with Twitter, if they weren't already, and then Twitter would call back into our application with information about who the user is. In our picture here, that would basically cover wiring up the form, though in a slightly different form, and the authenticating user portions of this auth flow. But notice also this local strategy. This is the one that we'll use, and local just means that Passport's plumbing will supply us with a username and or email and a password. Then it's up to our app to do the rest. We could check these values against a flat file or Redis. We could wire up our own call to some third-party service if we so wished, or we could just use the database, which is what we're going to do. But notice that if we switch from Twitter to local, we only touch these first two parts of the tree. Regardless of how we authenticate the user, that is independent of these other steps. Let's talk briefly about how that's going to work, understanding that it will be even more clear when we implement it all. When a user logs in, we're going to put information about that user into a cookie. What we put into the cookie is determined by the code that we write for serializing the user. Taking that cookie information and turning it into a usable user object is what deserialization does. We essentially implement the functions that do these tasks, and those functions take defined parameters. Passport supplies us with those arguments at runtime, along with callbacks, and then we call those callbacks with our responses. Authorization works the same way. This will be so much clearer in the next episode, so I beg your indulgence here until then, but feel free to shoot any questions you may have in the comments. Now, each of those strategies that we saw has its own module. We want the local one, so we need to install it. And that's, again, npm install -- save passport local. With those installed, we're ready to start hooking things up next time. And I hate to do this, but we have to call it quits here. If not, this episode is going to get really long, and I doubt either of us has the time for that. But here's the big benefit. If you need to go back to where the actual wiring up happens, you can pretty much just skip this episode the second time and just use the next one. In seriousness though, Passport works very differently from other authentication libraries that I've used, and I think it's pretty important to understand where Passport sits and what it actually does. Our goal here was to show that Passport is the plumbing of our auth system, but that we're still free to write the various components in a manner specific to our application. Passport really pulls out the parts that are common to all apps, and then we write little components that tie this abstraction to the specifics of what we're doing. Now, we came dangerously close to writing some code in this episode, and next time we absolutely will. Until then, happy coding.